All right, thank you everyone for joining. This is the Gateway API Inference Extension Community Meeting for February 20th of 2025. Can't believe we're almost into March of the new year. Pretty crazy, but thank you everyone for joining. As with all CNCF projects, we follow the CNCF guidelines of being kind and respectful to one another during the meeting. So otherwise, we have some issues. So please follow the CNCF guidelines. The meeting is being recorded, so if you don't want to be recorded, please drop off. With that said, let's get into the agenda. Before we started this recording, Rob and I kind of had a bit of an ad hoc conversation around inference pool nested status. As I've gone through the K-Gateway implementation, I have seen just some hurdles that I've needed to overcome to essentially ensure that the controller responsible for reconciling inference pools is only reconciling inference pools that it is responsible for, and not reconciling all inference pools. And so the action item is Rob's going to create an issue in the repo. So we'll have that here as an action item for others to take a look at in more detail. Next on the agenda, review action items from the. Oh, go ahead.
I just had like a follow up on this one. You were talking about like inference pool. I just want to bring up like the inference model status in general. We've got a bunch of conditions there. And just to discuss like what are our expectations, who's going to own the update of that status and the inference model.
So if I'm remembering how this works correctly, there would never be a case where a gateway implementation would need to know or care about an inference model, or at least not. I mean, maybe theoretically in the future, but nothing that we're doing right now requires that, right?
Clayton, we had a discussion with Clayton just before this one. That's why I wanted to bring it up.
Yeah, basically we were chatting about status, and I think like a big mistake we made in Ingress in the very first version of Cube was that there was no status object, and that was like one of the first things that OpenShift added to correct that grievous flaw. Because in practice, like as an end user, if you don't know that your route is working or why, that's the number one most important thing you can fail on. So we were just chatting about that, and I was asking Abdullah and Kellen was like, the endpoint picker, we want to keep a lot of logic out of the endpoint picker. The endpoint picker has some info that the gateway controller may not. Whose responsibility is to update inference model status and inference pool status, and what are the key ones that we want to focus on? So like my suggestion was whatever's in the getting started guide, if it can go wrong in a way that somebody can screw up doing a mapping, I think you should expect to see, like, as I was thinking, like minimum viable problem is if you screw up something that would cause your inference model request to go into the ether, you see that on inference model status. If you screw something up with your deployment, such the gateway controller cannot satisfy your request, it shows up on the inference model and possibly also on the inference pool, and possibly also on the inference model if reasonable. And while this is a net new requirement, I think the question was, which component today owns this? Does it think that it owns this? And do we have the information channels between it? So like one of the other examples we were giving is like, if you have no pool, if you have no endpoints in a pool, is it the gateway controller's responsibility to flag that status on the inference pool, which means that the gateway controller needs to know about all the backends. And so there's some requirements and responsibilities for the gateway controller that we were all vague when we were having this chat. So Rob.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. And this is related to one of the things that Lior kind of had discovered or pointed out is basically the initial work in progress or POC that we had with Envoy Gateway using like patch policies or whatever. It was using original dest, which meant that basically if we follow this all the way through, a controller doesn't need to know anything about the inference pool endpoints, right? It just, whatever endpoint picker tells me to send to, I will do, right? But more recently, we added the idea of a fail open to the API that just barely squeezed in before 0.1 released. And if you fail open, then you need something like the controller needs, or the gateway needs some idea of what to fall back to, which means it probably needs to know the endpoints that an inference pool has, which if you take that the next step further, it probably means that controller should be responsible for communicating that status on inference pool. But inference model, I think, is still one that it feels squarely owned by endpoint picker, in my opinion.
Okay, so you say owned by endpoint picker, but a model references a pool. If that pool doesn't exist, whose responsibility is it to say you referenced a pool that does not exist and your model does not go anywhere? And I think that is actually a good status that should exist, probably.
I think it does. As a condition, we have it in the API.
Well, no, but it is the classic chicken and egg problem. We had a similar problem in Gateway where if someone creates a gateway and uses a class that doesn't exist, who, assuming there are multiple controllers, so what we did instead is we created a default condition on Gateway that says pending waiting for controller, basically. Like, we don't have anything to pick this up right now. When something picks this up, it's going to remove this.
Okay, so you answered one of the examples. Are there any scenarios, for instance, like, we've talked about a couple of things like lazy pool matching or something, where someone could, specify labels instead of a specific pool ref, and, they could get magic as a service kind of operations. The assumption in some of those cases is there's something doing magic. And so the answer is always the person who's doing the magic about mapping inference pools and validating them against pool servers. I still am a little, and this was the discussion that Kellen brought up that I wanted to flag, was like, I'm a little nervous about endpoint picker being a controller in the classic cube sense. And Kellen's argument was like, it has no status right operations. And like, it's a nice thing where you can separate the security boundaries of what it's responsible for. Like, if it gets corrupted, the worst it can do is corrupt the things under it, but it can't lie about that outside the system. This leaves a space, which is if it's not the gateway controller that's handling some of these models, pool validations or intersections, then there's a missing controller. And is that part of the OSS project? I think one of the arguments that was going through my head is, just as we were jumping over, was if we're going to have multiple gateway controllers that they're all implementing the same kind of boilerplate, that would be bad. And so that is an argument for something that's a little bit more centralized. Abdullah made the point, like, we could let the endpoint pickers be writers. I think this is like a philosophy of what is the long-term architecture we're looking for that we don't have like a really concrete answer on. We'd kind of been leaning towards pickers being fairly stateless, fairly small, because that opens them up for forking and decomposition. Like the best endpoint picker is someone writes a 20-line Python file and it just works. Because there's going to be people who are going to want to write algorithms in Python, for instance.
One concern, let's say that gateway controller is the one that is responsible for validating inference models, right? So this gateway controller doesn't actually do anything with them, right? So if gateway controller has a view of the world that, no, this inference model is valid and it's attached to the right pool and everything's good, but endpoint picker is the one that's actually implementing the guidelines in inference model and doesn't know what to, like, its logic is different and doesn't know how to map that, then you've one controller communicated, yeah, everything's good, and the controller that's actually doing something with inference model, being endpoint picker or equivalent, doesn't know what to do, right? It it's a disconnect. And so it feels like you always want status to be written by the thing that is actually implementing the resource. And so we could have a library or something that made that
So
machinery
I will
easier.
say, having actually written this in lots of ingress controllers, it was a mistake to integrate it inline. So for like the OpenShift router, wrote status across as many ingress controllers as you needed to support HA proxy, which obviously would be like, some of OpenShift's original scenarios were hundreds or 200,000 services and routes on clusters. And so as a consequence of that, you had extremely resource constrained, high throughput endpoint things taking, a critical control path plane function as well. And that was a mistake. So I would probably say if we can make the argument that the load on endpoint picker or the variability of endpoint picker, like it's need to be customized for a wide set of use cases, it may not be appropriate for it to take a control plane function, in which case we're like, and I think that would be like, there's some cutoff there where no, data plane components should not implement control plane functions. So we're just saying, like, where does that control plane component live? And is there a scenario where that shared, and I think this is shared too, like it's probably related to some of the mechanics of endpoint picking. Operationally, should it be coupled to the data plane component is a little harder of a push for me. Like kube proxy does not write status back. That was probably the right decision. I
Right.
don't.
Kubelet
Right.
does go on the pods.
And Kubelet owns the pods and owns their life cycle. I do not actually know that endpoint pickers own the life cycle.
Well, it's the only component that actually actuates on it. And just a second. Like my concern here is that how do we ensure that the endpoint picker did actually acknowledge that I'm aware of this thing and I'm actuating?
Which endpoint picker? All of the endpoint pickers, a quorum of the endpoint pickers, whichever endpoint picker holds the write lock. The oldest version, the new one that didn't work when we were rolling out a new endpoint picker because somebody broke the update logic, and so it says it's accepting all the old requests. Even
But
though the new version,
if like an external component did it, then you have the same questions, right? Like,
but and we had the discussion. We were having a discussion.
It doesn't really solve that problem. It's actually also a bit misleading, right? Like if that other component says, "Oh, you're good to go."
I don't think status is intended to report liveness of the data plane. Kubernetes is a data plane for pods. The control plane of Kubernetes absolutely does need to report the liveness of pods because you have a bunch of semantics around it. Do we need to report the liveness of an individual gateway server via the control or endpoint picker via the control plane? No. Do we need to catch kind of obvious errors that humans are going to make and give them good things so that they can operate? Maybe the best angle for this is to go case by case on the conditions and say this should not be in the endpoint picker.
Right.
Here's
just
why.
one last thing: the number of ready pods is kind of live status, right? It continuously reconciles on that.
But the kubelet is a singleton too, and I think that's the distinction here. Is that gateway endpoint pickers are not.
Number of ready pods on deployment, like all of these things, they do get reported on status.
They get aggregated and summarized, and they represent a previous view of the state. Agreed. Yeah, I'm not arguing against conditions. I'm just trying to tease apart what principle we're using here to say that the gateway controller shouldn't. And Rob, I heard the principle stated that the gateway controller not needing to be aware of inference models is a good thing. I kind of agree with that because we've talked about we want inference API to be flexible to novel extension. And so then your counter argument of it needs to be related to its interpretation, I think is taken. The endpoint picker could be viewed as a controller in one respect. It is a scheduler. It is performing exactly the same function as the kube scheduler, which is it watches a control plane component that is instructing it. If the kube scheduler stops, you have a problem on your cluster. Like if your cluster is intended for batch workloads, the scheduler is a data plane component from the perspective of accomplishing business function. So I don't think the controller versus not controller distinction should be used as an argument here, that we couldn't say, for instance, that we want the endpoint picker to be resilient, having a single writer protocol with failover. We want it, Rob, you mentioned fail open. Writing status should not block data plane components, but neither should extensive data plane load result in long delayed status. Like we shouldn't design as if control plane component could be swamped by data plane responsibilities.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to suggest that this should be. We should further complicate our stack, but I do think there's room for a control plane data plane separation at the endpoint picker level, and maybe control plane becomes the standard thing that, again, the only thing that you actually really need to modify if you're forking endpoint picker is the data plane side, for example, or maybe you only need to modify the control plane side. I don't know. I don't know.
I think that's my biggest concern is if we push anything to the EPP, we're essentially pushing it to the user to be responsible for. The person I picture deploying an EPP doesn't want to care about Kubernetes operators. They want to deal with their LLM workloads or their generative AI workloads. And so if something goes wrong with the operator, they now have to go debug it, and I'm worried about that experience.
I want to push back on that a tiny bit, Kellen, because there is an expectation that an inference platform admin is going to deploy components on their Kubernetes cluster that allow them to accomplish inference platform duties. I agree. The topology and the argument, like as Rob, you were saying, an example would be, we've talked about we want endpoint picker to remain relatively small and cohesive on units of function. You could have the repo also have a secondary, binary, or just the same binary run in a different mode, which is, a sidecar that tries to take a lock, and when it fails, it restarts in classic controller fashion. And so there's a, EPP is a replicated set of components that have a data plane clear component alongside a control plane leader elected component, both sourced from the same code base, but not explicitly coupled together. So I think that's a lesson from some of the other examples we gave here. It would be this probably should not be embedded in EPP. The process would be my preference, but a sidecar container running in a replicated deployment set, taking a lock on config map is a totally reasonable kube thing to do. And I don't think that would add, I would say, Kellen, it probably would not add additional complexity, other than in, are there scenarios where the EPP data plane component, the distributed nature of the EPP data, the EPP as a data plane component, what you were bringing up, Abdullah, is like, do we actually need to record first scene? And just first scene imply that everyone sees it. And the control plane components in Cube actually have this problem right now, certainly from the perspective of like rolling out feature gates. And when you inform config changes, it's important to know when config changes have finished rolling out. And that is a problem that you can't do just by, having one of the controllers win. You actually have to know about the different controllers. You have to say we reached a state. Now, an easy thing we could probably say is that could be the gateway controller's responsibility, for instance, to have some coordination with EPPs or some protocol between them and EPPs to indicate that they've reached the latest config state.
One status I was thinking about related to like one of the main features we want to do, which is like rolling new adapters, right? Is you've got like this other component that is actually doing the rollout of the adapter, making sure that the model servers are aware of the new adapter, like V2. And then the operator needs to go and then change the inference model API to do the traffic splitting, right? So we want to have a status somewhere that says, well, the model is now available on the backend, right? One hypothetical like suggestion, or just like opening an issue about this, is should we track this on the inference, like maybe pool? What like, you know, what models of the ones that are currently attached are available? I mean, this is going to be like explosive, right? Like if we were to say like, okay, the model servers should support millions of adapters, then that's not going to work.
I think, and I mean, we have this in the end. We need to port this from the doc that we have, Rob and Abdullah. The like what scale characteristics, like that needs to be in it. I'll put that on my list of things to go do. Is open we expect to support this many backends, and we expect to support this scenario. Therefore, architecturally, we should avoid enumerating the full list of adapters or something like that.
Right, but then we still need a way for the operator to know, okay, the adapter is now, like the model servers are now aware of this. It's probably a different component then, which is like a rollout operator.
Or even it could be like, I mean, Jajin calls this the, like in their architecture, they have a library of adapters. And I think a separate component managing a library of adapters acting on the system would be a great outcome for us to have, which is an inference model has an extensible characteristic that a separate controller can write a status condition that this is available. And that's completely decoupled from the rest of the chain of the system. And if the model server, like it's not the responsibility of the EPP to verify that, you know, and like the proposal on, you know, with Kellen that we talked about for VLLM is like, I really don't think the default config for everybody's model server should be you enumerate a list of adapters. I think it should be, that's between you and your storage admin and how you run adapters, but write it to a bucket and then lazy load stuff and flat and track errors. Like that's a pretty scalable system that works for every user. And if people need additional double accounting, they should be able to add that and, you know, for instance, configure their model servers in such a way as that they don't do unrestricted loads of adapters from an untrusted source or something. Greg also brought this up from a security perspective. You don't want to be able to, you want to think about the confused deputy attacks where you can trigger a dynamic load of somebody else's adapter if you've built a multi-tenant system around the gateway controller or around a gateway.
Okay.
This is a very, this was a very satisfying discussion for me.
Yeah,
I feel like the argument that I'm hearing kind of here is if we need, like, if we want to write a status that is not the domain of the gateway controller, we need to write down what the domain of the gateway controller is. Rob, Danian, can y'all take the, like, I feel like we want a principle encoded in a doc in one of our design docs that says gateway controllers should do X. And therefore, Kellen would explore a data plane. You know, if we can come up with a use case for setting a status condition, let's create a sidecar 2-container EPP deployment where one of them is, you know, same code base, one of them is acting as, you know, whether it's switched at command line time, probably the easiest, but one of them is acting as a elected controller to fill out status that should be common across all gateway implementations that are leveraging this EPP implementation.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to help with that one. Daniel, it sounds like you're interested in helping there too, define scope.
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind taking the lead, and then I could jump in.
Sure.
Just because I've got a lot going on with the implementation side of things right now. So
yeah, I get it.
And Rob, I just like, just as a bookkeeping note, I guess the place I feel like, and Kellen, maybe this is too, is I feel like docs should have architecture.md, and an architectural principle like this should show up in architecture.md.
Yeah, I mean, we have somewhere I think this would fit pretty neatly. Like we have guidelines for what we're expecting, or we should have guidelines for what we're expecting out of gateway implementations right now. So yeah, let me dig into that a bit further. But
Yeah, I mean, if it's in the site source, I guess I'm okay with that. Like, I'm thinking of Kube API conventions. We failed to, like, from the very beginning, what we should have done with Kube API conventions is had kubeapi.md, the principles that underpin it, and the conventions, and
Yeah.
then links to the subdocs. And so I, think we could easily do that even in the site guide. And that's just our authoritative reference.
Yeah, makes sense.
Just as my item at the end, I want to spend at least 10 minutes talking about that with folks. So if we could
Cool.
reserve time.
Yeah, go ahead.
Cool. Well, that was a good discussion. So we got some action items from that discussion. I don't know if there's any other action items that need to be taken. If so, could use people's help to add some items in AIs. But otherwise, we'll just move through the agenda here. Review action items from the previous meeting. Kellen, you've got your name here. Do you want to touch on anything?
Yeah, I'll go for it. So Shane, me and Shane were discussing, we opened up an issue within the Gateway API proper. We made everyone aware of this last week. Basically, we're just looking to work with Gateway early on to make sure what we are doing works with Gateway API as a whole. So getting consensus there. And then we had a bunch of issues that were untriaged in our repo. Apologies for the scheduling conflict, Danian, but myself and Abdullah went through the list and tried to either poke status, apply labels. I put a lot of help wanted on a few. Basically, if anyone wants to jump in and hop in and help, please do so. But that's it, just following up there.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for doing the triage. And if we scroll really quickly back to last week's AIs, I know I had one here that I knocked out, and that was consolidating the approach for benchmark tooling. Created the issue. Kellen, I see that this issue's been closed out in favor of the tooling repo. So thanks for organizing that as well.
They should all be cross-referenced, just
okay.
so we don't use any conversation, but yeah.
Okay, so all these should be good to go here then. All right, then we'll get back to the agenda here. Let's see here. So we reviewed the action items. Clayton, you're next on the agenda.
All right. So, and apologies to anybody who was the previous editor of the README. I have been taking a bunch of feedback from end users and, kind of reflecting on discussions I'm having where there's some confusion about what exactly it is that we do here. Can I steal the screen share? I'm going to share what I have a README PAD. I have a README update, which involves some naming, but it also I have a diagram that I'm working on, and Adal is doing architecture one, but I was. Thank you, Chrome tab. Right. So I opened a PR. I think it should have been shared with everybody on the call. I didn't add everyone, but I added a lot of people. And I was basically focused on like what it is that we do here. What are the benefits you get? And then a little bit more initial text. And we have the really good website, so I don't want to take away from the website. I didn't want to get too much into the details, but I wanted to move the README a little bit towards what I consider the job of README is in 2 sentences, describe what you do, describe what I'm going to, is what you offer appropriate for me, the reader, and what benefits am I expected to get. So I've been doing this a whole bunch of different documents. So I was like, okay, let me see if I can get this in a slightly better form. I'm also addressing the naming problem, which is Gateway API Inference Extension doesn't actually describe any of the benefits we have for people. And it also doesn't provide like a really nice, terse, off the cuff, what are we? What are we that everyone else is not? And I was kind of absorbing feedback from a bunch of people. We're not an AI gateway. We are not a gateway. We are an extension to a gateway. But after applying our extension, what does that gateway become? That was actually what I was trying to capture in these first two sentences. So in my terminology, and I'm testing this with folks here because I know I've had these arguments, is the act of extending a kube gateway makes it an inference gateway. What does an inference gateway do? It makes it easy for you to expose self-hosted models to a model, to someone who wants to consume models as a service, or to an AI gateway that wants to consume you as a model provider. That's our job. And I don't think that means that our code is an inference gateway, but our code plus a gateway absolutely makes it an inference gateway. So that's kind of my first argument. How do people feel about that?
No, I love that actually. I was really liking how you connected this extension to transform a gateway into an inference gateway, right? Like I think that's
and actually
really
everybody's
way.
feedback, it was like we were all like really close to that.
Yeah.
So it was like it's the an extension. What does the extension do? It makes a gateway more than some of its parts, while still benefiting from that. I don't quite have all the. I wanted to add something which was like, hey, when you do this, it's still a regular gateway. You get all those other awesome features, except, you know, I think that kind of is implied, but it's stuff like authorization, authentication. That's like a larger gateway theory. I'd love to like have a place to reference that, but maybe that's not like the key thing here. Like I don't need to sell you on gateway here. This README's job is to sell you on this project. Damien?
Yeah. So the one aspect of the project that I've been struggling with is the fact that it's actually tied to gateways and gateway API. Although I believe a vast majority of the implementations will use this project as an extension for a gateway API capable gateway. I believe there is also an addressable market and an opportunity that simple gateways that actually don't support gateway API could still leverage this extension. And so that's just something that I want to call out. And again, nothing against gateway API. Obviously, you know, I'm a big believer in it, but as I just try to look at this project individually, I think we need to just consider that I can go ahead and stand up an Envoy proxy and feed it, you know, a static configuration and have it integrate with Inference extension. So, you know, maybe
that was in
Sorry.
like some of those original goals for the project, and we kind of lost it as we've richened. But yeah, I think I agree, and that also aligns a little bit with most of what I consider like our competitor projects, quote unquote, are single purpose proxy routing code written as a, you know, an HTTP and makes sub calls. The thing that differentiates us is that the integration with Envoy, maybe we're not highlighting that enough here.
Yeah, so, you know, maybe that sweet spot is like, if we look at your doc here, is it could be something as simple as, instead of saying it a cluster gateway, it just, you know, an XProc, even more general, an XProc capable proxy, right? And then I think in the documentation, we do highlight that, hey, you know, we expect that most integrations would happen with Gateway API or some language around that. But again, I guess just the general thought that, hey, how do we highlight that we do integrate with Gateway API, but the extension is not dependent on Gateway API?
So I agree. We're in a Kubernetes SIGs project. So if I don't say the words Kubernetes in the first sentence, I have to give up my contributor card. But I think there is an argument there that there is a version of this project that does not live in Kubernetes SIGs that is, and maybe like that's a natural place. I guess the question is, if we don't have that now, are we going to lose key users we want right now. I totally agree. I think I like the xproc capable gateway or xproc capable proxy. Probably like it means Envoy today. I'd be happy pointing to Envoy there versus cluster gateway.
Yeah, one thing that I would add here is not to skip too far ahead, but I looked at your PR this morning, and you have a roadmap section as a to-do here, or roadmap comings. I forget exactly how you phrased it, but I think that's important, and I think that's these are the kinds of topics I think fit here. We can't really boil the ocean in, right now
so
before.
I think I agree that the idea, and this like Istio had this in its early roadmap, I remember, which is running not on clusters, but it wasn't the first thing that Istio pitched. Istio is about us being a service mesh. We expect it to run primarily on Kubernetes clusters, but we also expect it to integrate non-Kubernetes things into the mesh. And I think there's a similar analogy here. We can hit it. So I just list the 3 key benefits as I see them, which is single workload performance and how declarative APIs to allow you to do rollouts. And Adela, your doc that's forthcoming, I would probably link to there. And then operational guardrails, allowing a platform team to safely serve pools of LoRa adapters or whatever. I didn't say LoRa adapter in the last sentence, but I think it's kind of implied. I may have come up with, and there may be a terser way, a more like visually appealing way to present that. But I do think like listing the 3 benefits is key. Is there a benefit I missed? Maybe mentioning observability.
Yeah, I was just going to say.
Okay, observability. I'll check that.
And I don't know if you want to mention that. I don't know, like the metrics can be used for auto scaling and.
Yeah, that's auto scaling probably is a benefit. We don't have it really spec'd out, so maybe that's just we'll update the README when we have it. And we said we should put auto scaling in the roadmap. So I just like bulleted out like 5 things that I was like, these are obvious things that we're going to go do, but to someone reading our thing, they have no idea that we're ever going to go do them. So Rob, to your point, like I think that's a little bit of there. And then the last one was talking about the model server protocol. I think that's important because I'm seeing a bunch of people with their proxies be like, we plan to support other things. We only support VLLM today. So I think the fact that we have a protocol doc and the protocol doc is not onerous and that we reasonably could expect self-service on the protocol doc for model servers, we're in a better spot than some of the others out there. I love the website. I debated putting the website first, but I felt that the goal was to sell the project, the text. It's a picture.
Yeah.
So I am working on this picture. Let me just real quick. This still probably has too much in it. But probably too much text still, although I want to prune it based on what we and find it simpler. So I'm roughly just trying to show in a single picture what it is we do here. Highlight that an AI gateway is above us. Highlight that we're integrating into a Kubernetes gateway. Something that Abdullah had, which was the xproc protocol. Like we're extending a gateway and thus we become an inference gateway. I kind of wanted to have like a picture, like, gateway plus extension equals inference gateway, but I couldn't make the picture not make this diagram even worse. Maybe that is maybe like we need like a logo, like nobody's done a logo pitch, but we need a logo like gateway plus extension equals magic inference gateway, whatever. And I just took a quick stab at like, showing some of the YAMLs there. I don't know that all of this is truly necessary. I may just have a version of this and we can go like strip stuff out of it. But I'd rather have a diagram than no diagram. And I'd rather have a little bit more stuff than a little bit less stuff. People can always tell us like this is too much, too confusing, and we can slim it down. It's often harder to catch someone who like, I didn't get what I needed from your diagram. So I'm biasing a little bit towards verbosity in the first draft. So I'm going to convert this to an SVG before the end of the day. I might get into this PR or another. Any concepts that shouldn't be here? Like this is kind of the paragraph. I'm kind of aiming at the paragraph like your Kubernetes resources, on and off workload clusters, AI gateway extension at the middle, LoRa adapters, because I still think LoRa adapters are the actual novel, exciting thing. And then this may be unnecessary, but I do think there's nerds out there who are like, but exactly how are you benefiting? And I kind of have a summary up here and then a summary down here, or details here. I'm going to try and split these up and improve a little bit. Damien?
Yeah, I guess the one thing that, as I've visualized how the kind of the traffic flow works, is that the extension is kind of off to the side, and as opposed to kind of like flowing through it, and maybe that's just again the way that I interpret things, but it's like the way I look at this is like, or the way that I see it is the extension's off to the side, and it's like, okay, the gateway says, hey, extension, where should I route this? And then the extension gives a response, and it's in this picture, the Kubernetes gateway that routes it. And maybe that's just kind of my mental model that I built.
Maybe you're biased because you're a Kubernetes gateway maintainer. You're like, clearly the gateway is the most important thing in this diagram. And that's a fair point. I played around with a couple of versions where I tried to move it off to the side. And the problem is that from a visual, like top to bottom, it didn't make sense anymore, because you're like, you've got all this logic down below, but it's all of that logic is coming from the inference gateway. The gateway is really just delegating and then sending to a server. Maybe I think the nuance there is what we actually need is a better diagram that's deeper, which actually, and Abdullah was working on this a little bit.
So
it shows the full protocol. Why don't you take over?
Yeah, I think I shared this before. So the one that Daniel, do you want to, if you are a host, do you want to share it?
I just gave you co-host. You're good to go.
Oh, okay. I'm just afraid that I'm going to show the whole thing on my screen. I have no idea how. Zoom. Okay.
Just pick a tab.
Are you only seeing this document, or are you seeing my chat?
No.
Something about security numbers, bank statements. I don't know.
So I'm planning to put this in one of the documents inside the website, not on and just to explain the protocols, and link to the protocols, the one that groups these two things into the endpoint protocol, right? Like the extension and the model server, and the other contract, which is the model servers. So this one is the one that, like Daniel, it does put this on the side and clarifies that this is basically a call out, not really the one that is forwarding the request. So that could be in the details. Probably the first picture is fine for the one that had because it's easier to explain,
Yeah, my job is to lie to you selectively with that first diagram, and then you can come quibble. And if you quibble, then we've succeeded because you care enough to quibble. Like, well, actually. So I'll keep working on that one, and we can keep refining it. I want to get something as a picture so that you get hit in the face with a nice picture when you land on the README.
One thing, Clayton, I don't know if it is useful, is to some sort of color coding that indicates what are the components that we added.
Yeah, that's right. And it was tough because I was using before, this was like, I think we're adding everything.
Yeah.
So except AI gateway. So maybe like AI gateway and model as a service. I was trying to draw colors between, maybe I'll just do white for AI gateway, but each model as a service provider, I think the key message is we're turning your model servers into model as a service providers. Let me think about how to present that. Maybe I'll just use green for the inference gateway extension.
And Clayton, your level of detail, I like, and I think that goes perfectly in an architecture.md. Abdullah, what you have like in a resources.md and what I put in the chat window to have like a diagram that people see when they first hit like the docs website. I referenced the Envoy Gateway documentation because this is something that I was part of when I was maintaining the project, and we were at the same time in the early stages of the project, like, okay, how do we show this to people? And it's the feedback that we got was like, oh yeah, this is great. Now, obviously, this project we need to have a little more detail, but just something this simple where people could just look at it and say, oh, okay, I generally understand what's going on. And then if you want to dive into it, here, go to concepts or go to architecture, and you get
So
even.
Damien, I think you're right that there is a version of this diagram that is that, which is it's extension plus gateway equals inference gateway. Request traffic or AI gateway coming in, model servers acting as model server as a service. Let me think about that. And at worst, the first version of the diagram then moves to architecture, and the second version of the diagram is that. But I do want to have the second version of the diagram because I also have to explain the next level and the next level. So maybe that's actually the argument that we're making, is we want to catch the middle and make sure we can go use it in multiple contexts.
Yeah, it's kind of like crawl, walk, run, right? Someone new to the project looks at this and they're like, their brain explodes, right? So if they're able to go hit the site and be able to see a diagram and say, okay, I understand what's going on, and then they're crawling, and then like, okay, I'm crawling now, let me walk, and when they get to this diagram, they're either walking or running.
Yeah, and some of it too is like the difference between AI gateway and inference gateway matters a lot. And I think like the case I'm still making here is that we are an inference gateway. It's okay to use that in vernacular. When someone asks what the name of our repo and the name of what we are and the scope of our project, the scope of our project is to be a gateway API, gateway extension for inference. But what we are is an inference gateway. I want to at least try to land that message. Some of the deeper detail here can probably be broken into multiple diagrams over time. Cool. So I will do a couple revs, the README in the doc and images and share with our folks. So appreciate the feedback.
Yeah, thanks for taking it on too. All right. So I know we're running out of time here. Abdullah, we've got the issue 020 release tracker. Do you want to touch on that really quick before we wrap things up?
Yeah, just quickly. I've got this issue, like it's following up also on Kellen's triage point. So we've got a laundry list there. Please comment on like what things that should not be included and things that we're missing there, just to basically scope out what we want to target for 0.2. If you want to add another issue, please comment on that issue. Like if you want to add another task, just comment on that issue for us to add it. For the target release date, just want to start the discussion. We're targeting, hopefully we can target something before KubeCon. And one suggestion is first week of March, 1 week for release candidate, and then, or I don't know, maybe a few days for release candidate, and then do it for release. Just open it up for discussion, just like just one suggestion I have in mind here.
I just put in the chat window a link to the 020 RC1 milestone. I changed the date based on what you have here in the agenda doc. One thing that you see here is it's 100% complete. Like projects that I've worked on in the past, what we've done is actually use these milestones and issues, so that when you go to the milestones, you see like what the completion is. What I did in the meantime is I just added your tracking issue here as just kind of a workaround, but just something for us to consider. Like, do we want to keep doing kind of this tracker issue, or do we want to, be able to start, leveraging the milestone integration with, with issues, so that we could actually see this proper representation of where we're completed in the milestone. So something we don't have to address now, but I just wanted to kind of call it out.
But everybody like is fine with targeting March, first week of March. Any concerns? Any suggestions?
No, that'd be great.
Okay.
I mean, my
please-
biggest goal is that before we do O.2 release, we have some useful feedback from implementations that are close to complete by then. Because I think as we've been implementing this, we've all learned some gaps along the way. So hopefully we can get all the kinks out before we get O.2 out.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Cool. Excellent. Well, appreciate everyone's involvement and driving a lot of things, especially from my standpoint. I appreciate it because, like I said, I've kind of pivoted to really focusing in on getting the implementation done for K Gateway, and it's coming along. So far so good. And hope everyone has a great day, and we'll catch you online. Bye.
See you guys.